Boris Johnson may be on holiday, but his troubles seem to always find a way of hiding in his suitcase and coming along for the ride. We're all quite familiar with Boris Johnson's Education Secretary's famous U-turn in recent days, but this is one of many cases of backpedaling by the bozo bunch. Over the last 8 months, Boris Johnson's government has carried out a number of high-profile U-turns, so let's have a look at some of them. So the first one is on the 21st of May. This was the NHS staff visa change. So a day after telling MPs that maintaining a controversial visa surcharge for overseas doctors and nurses staff was, quote-unquote, the right thing to do, Number 10 announced the policy had been dropped. Boris faced severe pressure from MPs across the spectrum to exempt those working for the NHS and in social care services from the ridiculous charge of £400, which was paid by immigrants in the UK. NHS staff had added emotional appeals, which showed the government as uncaring in the court of public opinion. Boris was also expected to take part in the weekly Clap for Carers event on the day that the U-turn was made. This would have shown the complete hypocrisy of the original surcharge. Now, our next U-turn took place on the 4th of June. This was the MPs' voting procedures. Hundreds of UK parliamentarians lined up to vote in what was nicknamed the Jacob Rees-Congo, as a way of replacing the remote voting system that had actually been in place since the pandemic hit. As well as looking absolutely ridiculous, the system was also controversial. Mogg at the beginning actually refused to allow remote voting for MPs who could not attend Parliament due to medical issues or because they were too old to stand in line for the hours required to vote. Jacob Rees-Mogg, of course, stuck to his guns for 2 days, because later plans to allow vulnerable members to vote by proxy were approved. At the time, I mentioned how this was a mechanism to defend Boris Johnson from scrutiny. In Parliament, Boris needed his yahoos shouting behind him, and because Parliament had been pretty much empty, he was exposed. The bully didn't have his fan base. And Jacob Rees-Mogg was attempting to force parliamentarians back into Parliament in order to give Boris Johnson his moral support. So our next Tory cock-up is on June the 9th, the reopening of all primary schools. Now, Education Secretary Gavin Williamson, who's quite popular at the moment for other reasons, shelved plans to fully reopen all primary schools for all pupils before the summer holidays. Why did he do that? Because those schools were not prepared to deal with the pandemic. Now, this had all been part of the government's recovery strategy, which was released back in May, but teachers, unions and politicians from all sides said that it was too soon, and at the same time the reproduction rate of the virus was still too high in many parts of the country. Williamson dumped the plan and said the target had changed to welcoming all children back in September instead. I believe the Tory government were under pressure from business owners to get their staff members back into work, and with schools being closed, parents had to stay at home and look after those children. Business owners were putting profit before their workers' welfare, and of course this was supported by the Conservative Party until they were forced to U-turn. Now, our next high-profile U-turn took place on the 16th of June. This was the free schools meals over the summer. Manchester United footballer Marcus Rashford, along with a group of cross-party MPs, forced the Prime Minister to extend the government's free school meal scheme throughout the summer holidays. Rashford spoke emotionally of his experience of relying on free school meals and food banks when he was younger, and this was a driving message for the campaign. Boris Johnson, risking a parliamentary rebellion, called Rashford personally to announce the reversal. So let's return to the pandemic for a moment and look at the next U-turn, which was on the 18th of June and surrounded the famous centralised app. Now, Matt Hancock announced back in May that trials were underway for a new contract tracing app on the Isle of Wight. He said that it would be a nationwide app and it would be released in a number of weeks. Now, almost 4 months later, there is no app, and Matt Hancock has basically outsourced the work to Google and Apple. Matt had touted the abilities of the Health Services Innovation Unit, but due to the overload of problems, bugs and issues, it was eventually dumped and big tech were asked to help. I would put this down to the Brexit mentality of, we don't need experts, we can do it all by ourselves. Huawei on the 14th of July is the next U-turn. So the ban on Huawei was not just about using its technology, but also a new approach to dealing with China. Boris had given the Chinese technology company free rein to set up equipment around the country, but under pressure from the US to block them, along with unrest growing within his own party, Boris Johnson pulled the plug. This was a particularly interesting U-turn because most of the pressure came from outside, not within the UK. The United States put pressure on Boris Johnson to pull the plug on Huawei, and he did it. Didn't the UK just vote to leave a bloc because they didn't want to be told what to do? This U-turn straddles both May and June, and it was the quarantine and air bridges fiasco. So from the beginning of the pandemic, back in March and April, Britain didn't have any quarantine measures in place for travellers arriving from abroad. Then, out of the blue, Priti Patel announced plans for a blanket 14-day quarantine for all travellers to Britain. However, shortly after, a quarantine exemption list of 73 countries was released. But recently, British holidaymakers have been facing chaos as country after country was removed from that list at very short notice, sometimes a day before. This demonstrates that the quarantine was not taken seriously at the beginning, and the exemption list hasn't been taken seriously either. So this brings us to our final U-turn, the exam results. So following on the heels of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, Boris Johnson's government in Westminster announced on the 17th of August that English students will also receive the A-level grades their teachers predicted for them after all. The decision to ignore the most hated algorithm and grant students the teacher-assessed grades was a result of protests over the weekend by students and growing pressure from Boris Johnson's own supporters, including Penny Mordaunt, a member of Boris Johnson's own cabinet. Williamson, the Education Secretary, later apologised for the harm caused to students as he announced the change of the system. What's funny about all of this is when this scenario played itself out in Scotland, members of the Conservative Party supported a vote of no confidence in the Education Secretary in Scotland. But when it happened in England, the Tories were completely silent about whether Mr. Williamson should reconsider his position. This government is a bunch of incompetent fools that is not fit for purpose. It is made up of people who are unconcerned about how their policies affect ordinary people. They will only bend when they are forced by massive protests or, unfortunately, a member of their own party grows a heart and demands change. I expect to see more U-turns before the end of this parliament. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. Why not become a Patreon and enjoy access to our Discord server where we share news, chat, and have some fun? If you become a patron, you can also make video suggestions on topics that are important to you. Check it out via the link in the description.